Paramahamsa Parivajagacharya Ashtottara Shri Srimad His Divine Grace Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Jai. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivajagacharya Ashtottara Shri Srimad His Divine Grace Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada Ki Jai. Ananda Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai. Srila Namacharya Haridas Thakur Ki Jai. Prem se kaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivas Hari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinath Shyama Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhan Ki Jai. Shri Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai. Shri Navadvip Mayapur Dham Ki Jai. Shri Jagannath Puri Dham Ki Jai. Shri Gangamayi Ki Jai. Shri Yamunamayi Ki Jai. Bhakti Devi Ki Jai. Tulsi Devi Ki Jai. Samaveta Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. Hare Krishna. All glories to the assembled devotees. Hare Krishna. All glories to the assembled devotees. Hare Krishna. All glories to Sri Guru and Sri Gaura. All glories to Sri Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 Thank you for joining us for the Srimad Bhagavatam class this morning. We're on the 9th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, chapter 3, entitled The Marriage of Sukanya and Chavana Muni. And we're on text 12. So I'll go ahead and recite the verse and you can repeat. Graham grahishye somasya. Graham grahishye somasya. Yagye vamapya somapo. Yagye vamapya somapo. Kriyatam neva yorupam. Kriyatam neva yorupam. Pramadanam yadipsitam. Pramadanam yadipsitam. Graham grahishye somasya.
Graham grahishye somasya.
Yagye vamapya somapo.
Yagye vamapya somapo.
Kriyatam neva yorupam.
Kriyatam neva yorupam.
Pramadanam yadipsitam.
Pramadanam yadipsitam.
Graham grahishyase. Graham grahishye somasya.
Graham grahishye somasya.
Yagye vamapya somapo.
Yagye vamapya somapo.
Kriyatam neva yorupam.
Kriyatam neva yorupam.
Pramadanam yadipsitam.
Pramadanam yadipsitam.
Would anyone like to chant?
Graham grahisye somasya.
Graham grahishye somasya.
Yagye vamapya somapaha.
Yagye vamapya somapo.
Kriyatam neva yorupam.
Kriyatam neva yorupam.
Pramadanam yadipsitam.
Pramadanam
somasya.
Graham grahishe somasya.
Yakyevam apyasomapo.
Yakyevam apyasomapo.
Kriyatam
Kriyameva yorupam.
Pramadam
Pramadhanam Graham grahishe somasya.
Graham grahishe somasya.
Yagivam apyasomapo.
Yagivam apyasomapo.
Kriyatameva yorupam.
Kriyatameva yorupam.
Pramadhanam yadipsitam.
Pramadhanam yadipsitam. Mataji's?
Graham grahishe somasya. Yagivam apyasomapo. Kriyatameva yorupam. Pramadhanam yadipsitam. Graham grahishe somasya. Yagivam apyasomapo. Kriyatameva yorupam. Pramadhanam yadipsitam.
Graham,
Graham,
a full pot.
full pot.
Grahishe,
grahishe,
I shall give.
I shall give.
Somasya,
Somasya,
of somarasa.
somarasa,
Yagye,
yagye,
in sacrifice.
in sacrifice,
Vam,
vam,
of both of you.
of both of you,
Api,
api,
although.
although,
Asomapo,
asomapo,
of you two,
you two,
who are not eligible
who are not eligible
to drink somarasa.
to drink somarasa,
Kriyatam,
kriyatam,
just execute.
just execute,
Me, my.
my,
Vayaha,
vayaha,
young age.
young age,
Rupam,
rupam,
beauty of a young man.
beauty of young man,
Pramadhanam,
pramadhanam,
of women as a class.
women's
Yat,
Yeah.
which is.
which is
Ipsitam,
ipsitam,
desirable.
desirable.
Okay, there's going to be a string of a few verses without purport. Well, there's going to be one with a very small one and then one with a more substantial one. So we'll just read about 5 or 6 verses. And the translation and purports are by His Divine Grace, Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki.
Jai.
Chavana Muni said, although you are ineligible to drink somarasa in sacrifices, I promise to give you a full pot of it. Kindly arrange beauty and youth for me, because they are attractive to young women. Patamityuchaturvipram abhinandyabhishaktamo nibajatam bhavanasmin hrade siddhavinirmite. The great physicians, the Ashwini Kumaras, very gladly accepted Chavana Muni's proposal. Thus they told the Brahmana, just dive into this lake of successful life. One who bathes in this lake has his desires fulfilled. Ityukto jadayagrasta deho dhamani santataha pradam praveshito swibhyam vali palita vigraha. After saying this, the Ashwini Kumaras caught hold of Chavana Muni, who is an old, diseased invalid with loose skin, white hair, and veins visible all over his body, and all 3 of them entered the lake. Purport. Chavana Muni was so old that he could not enter the lake alone. Thus the Ashwini Kumaras caught hold of his body, and the 3 of them entered the lake. Purushasthaya utastur apivya vanita priya padmasraja kundalinas tulya rupa suvasasaha. Thereafter, 3 men with very beautiful bodily features emerged from the lake. They were nicely dressed and decorated with earrings and garlands of lotuses. All of them were of the same standard of beauty. Tan nirikshya vararoha sarupan surya varchasa ajanati patim sadhvi ashwinau sharanam yayo. The chaste and very beautiful Sukanya could not distinguish her husband from the two Ashwini Kumaras, for they were equally beautiful. Not understanding who her real husband was, she took shelter of the Ashwini Kumaras. Purport. Sukanya could have selected any one of them as her husband, for one could not distinguish among them. But because she was chaste, she took shelter of the Ashwini Kumaras, so that they could inform her who her actual husband was. A chaste woman will never accept any man other than her husband, even if there be someone equally as handsome and qualified. Okay. Om Ajnana Timirantasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhakti Vedanta Swamin Iti Namine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatharine Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. I'd like to first of all ask the blessings of all the Vaishnavas assembled, that I can become capable of saying something that's valuable and helpful in everyone's spiritual life, and that's faithful to our Guru Parampara as it's been passed down by His Divine Grace, Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Okay. So in this part of the Bhagavatam, the Srimad Bhagavatam, we're hearing about the pastime of Chavana Muni and Sukanya. Sukanya's father, Maharaj Sharyati, he was put in a difficult situation when his daughter accidentally offended Chavana Muni, and in order to satisfy Chavana Muni, he offered him his daughter Sukanya to become his wife. And Sukanya, having been trained in the Vedic principles, even though Chavana Muni was quite old, and as we're hearing, he was diseased, and all the veins are apparent in his arms, all over his body. She was very chaste and faithful in serving him. And after some time, when the Ashwini Kumaras came to visit, Chavana Muni took the opportunity to request them to give him youthful life, to restore his youth. Thank you. So one of the first things that we learn when we come to the Krishna consciousness movement, or somehow we come in contact with devotees or start reading Srila Prabhupada's books, is we learn about what the actual problems of life are. And in the Bhagavad Gita, it's described, Janma Mrityu Jara Vyadhi Dukkha Doshanudarshanam. Krishna is describing what intelligence is, what knowledge is, in the Bhagavad Gita. And he says that one of the items of knowledge, one of the ways by which you can recognize a person who's in knowledge or an intelligent person is if they can recognize that there are these four things in the material world which are which basically spoil everything that we're trying to accomplish here. They basically spoil all our hopes of being happy or attaining a pleasant existence in the material world. So those four things are birth, disease, old age, and death. And Srila Prabhupada would sometimes give this example of a pot of sweet rice. If you have a very delectable pot of sweet rice, been perfectly cooked, it's got just the right consistency and color, and it's very, very delicious. You know, devotees are always eager to relish the sweet rice when it's there as part of the festivals or feasts. But Prabhupada describes that if you take just one small pinch of sand and you drop it into that sweet rice and you mix it in, then no matter how sweet and creamy the sweet rice is, the sand just gets between your teeth and agitates, and it's not actually possible to relish it. And so, although people have many aspirations in the material world to enjoy by different kinds of means, many people feel that if they can simply acquire a good position in the world, whereby they can gain a nice income and fill their bank accounts, and then they can fill their lives with a nice home, nice amenities and furniture, technological conveniences, and have a nice husband or wife, have children, sort of live the dream. They feel that this will be sufficient for making them happy, but if they haven't recognized that there's these four problems, this bit of sand that's been put in the sweet rice that makes the whole thing impossible to actually enjoy, then they're actually consigning themselves to a life of there's one American writer from the 19th century who is famous for many statements, but one of his statements that he's famous for is that most men in this world lead lives of quiet desperation. So as long as we are seeking happiness in this world and we don't recognize what these four problems, these big problems in life are, then we're consigning ourselves to a life of desperation. And quiet desperation means that you may not necessarily see that the person is actually going through a great deal of suffering. We have a tendency to not want to show that because it seems like everybody else is actually happy, and so we don't want to be the only one in the bunch who's suffering. So we may put up an image that everything's okay, and therefore the word quiet is important in that statement. Most men lead lives of quiet desperation. And so Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita is inviting us to recognize this and come out of that life of quiet desperation. He informs us that dukhalayam ashashvatam, actually this whole material world and everyone in it is everyone in this world is actually suffering. I'm not just the odd duck out, but everybody's going through this suffering, and that's the real. So the real problems of life are birth, disease, old age, and death. And we hear in this case that Chavana Muni, generally we are completely helpless to counteract these forces. Even though nobody wants to get old, we're all forced over time to become old. Our body doesn't work as well as it used to. Our hair turns gray, and as we just saw here, our skin becomes loose, and veins become visible all over the body. And nobody actually desires to have this development take place in their life, but everybody's forced to go through it. Everybody's forced to become invalid over course of time, incapable of using our arms and legs, which used to, used to always reliably we could do as we liked. We could run and skip and jump. And so Chavana Muni he's in this very debilitated condition brought about by disease and old age, and one would say that he's probably close to death after hearing the descriptions given here. And so the fact that he's by making this deal with the Ashwini Kumaras, that he'll provide them with one pot of somarasa if they fulfill his youth. Chavana Muni is fulfilling a wish that many people have, that they would like to fulfill. But then, of course, would it actually be good for them? Would it actually be beneficial for them to be able to simply counteract in a kind of cosmetic way the march of old age? In Srila Prabhupada's books, we're exposed to actually what is the ultimate solution to disease, old age, and death, and that is that as long as we're under the influence of the material energy, then we're forced to suffer these things. But by simply surrendering to Krishna, one can easily overcome that material energy and thus easily overcome disease, old age, death, and then of course rebirth, which causes us to have to relive the other three. This material energy is also ultimately one of the divine energies of the Lord. And thus, if one surrenders to the Lord and engages in the processes of devotional service that begin from hearing about Krishna, describing Krishna, chanting Krishna's names, always remembering Krishna, serving the deities in the temple, always taking the opportunity to serve Krishna's lotus feet in one way or another, etc., then this actually presents an absolute solution to birth, disease, old age, and death, and one can become deathless. One can even in this lifetime transcend death, and yes. So although there may be remedies to cosmetically counteract diseases or old age or death, these actually, in many cases, are not good for people because they just allow them to go on in the illusion that everything is okay and that they'll never have to meet death one day. And so we find in Queen Kunti's prayers, she says, Janma Ishwarya Shruta Shribhir, Eda Mana Madapuman, Naibarhat Devidatum Bai, Twama Kanchana Gocharam. She mentions four things that many people covet. Janma, this is a high birth in the material world, or high status, having a prestigious position in society. Aishwarya means having great riches or wealth. Shruta means being a greatly learned person, a scholar that others look up to for knowledge and guidance. And Shribhi means beauty, having great beauty. And of course, it's in our youth that we're most beautiful. So having great beauty and youth is very much a coveted thing in the material world. And but actually, Queen Kunti in her prayers, she's not praying to receive these things. She's actually stating that these are great dangers because by these four things, a living entity can become intoxicated. Mada Puman. One can become intoxicated. People are intoxicated by their youth, by their learning, by their wealth, by their high status in society. And intoxicated in this case means that they don't think about what the purpose of life actually is. They don't think about the fact that just like everybody else, I'm going to have to die no matter how, what qualities I may have, beauty or riches. Everybody's going to have to face that moment where all of these things are taken away. We move into another phase of our life. Many people don't know what it is that's going to happen at that point. but everybody has to admit that at the very least they know they can't take anything with them. And and so that's what intoxicated means. It means that they forget that in this human, they don't give attention to the fact that in this human form of life, there's actually an opportunity to go beyond just basic enjoyment of the senses, which is available in every species of life, whether one is a dog or a cat. Everybody's experiencing pleasure, and through the senses in some way or another. And so in the human form of life, we have extra facility to think, why is it that death is forced upon me, even though I don't want it? Why is it that I'm getting older, even though I feel like I should just stay youthful forever? I feel like I'd rather do that. And because these four opulences, they distract one from these questions, they intoxicate one with the aroma of the material world, then one doesn't fulfill the real mission of life. And therefore, and she states in this verse that in such a condition of intoxication, one cannot sincerely surrender to the Lord. It's very difficult to actually approach the Lord with some sincere feeling that one needs the Lord, one is dependent on the Lord. And as we heard from this other verse in Bhagavad Gita, that without surrendering to the Lord, then, who's the master of all the material energies, then we remain subjugated by the material energies, and we're forced to go through the cycle of birth and death. So quite contrary to popular opinion, Queen Kunti is regarding these four things as a potential danger. Of course, that doesn't mean that if one has any of these qualities that one automatically must forget the goal of life. It is possible to utilize all these things in the service of Krishna and remain sober, but in general the tendency is to become intoxicated by them. And so actually, if we're unable to acquire all of these pleasing qualities in the world, and instead we're met with many obstacles, then actually our situation may be more fortunate. And that's why in the verse just before this, Queen Kunti says, Vipada santita shaswat tatra tatra jagat guru bhavato darshanam yatsyad apunar bhavadarshanam. Queen Kunti is referencing all the difficulties and obstacles that she and her sons had to go through, such as one of her young sons being almost poisoned by a cake, the house that they were living in being booby-trapped to catch on fire and immediately kill them. They were banished to the forest to live very austere lives, very uncertain, and face many obstacles. And however, she's saying in this verse that let those obstacles come again and again, because when we're facing those obstacles, we can see you. We can see you, and we see essentially how we're dependent on you, and we need you at every moment. And by seeing you, one never has to see repeated birth and death again. And so, in this pastime, we're hearing how Chavana Muni was presented by the Ashwini Kumaras a lake which fulfills one's desires. And then the word for word it says siddha vinirmite, which is especially meant for all kinds of perfection. So it's a lake where one can attain any kind of perfection one wants. And although many people may dream like, oh, that would be so wonderful to be able to, where's this lake? I'd like to dive in also and fulfill my desires. But would it actually be good for us? Are we actually more fortunate that we don't have access to such a lake? Even those of us who are practicing devotional service, at least like myself, as a practitioner in the very early stage, it could actually be very harmful for my health to have any such material desires fulfilled by having access to a lake like this. So actually the Lord, it's often described that the Lord is much more kind to the living entities than the demigods can be if one approaches the demigods for prosperity, because demigods such as Lord Shiva, Lord Shiva is Ashutosh. She's known as Ashutosh. She's very easily satisfied, and so he'll easily fulfill one's desires if they approach him. But Krishna has a different reputation. He is known for thinking first and foremost of the spiritual welfare of the living entity who approaches him. And so he may fulfill the desire of the living entity or may not fulfill it based on whether or not it will actually be good for that living being's spiritual progress, whether it will actually help that living being to succeed in the human mission of life. And so the Lord is the most kind of all. And therefore, but even though one could ask for the Lord, and the Lord who won't fulfill unless it's good for him, but still better to simply be satisfied with what the Lord has already given us. And in the Bhagavad Gita, the austerities of the mind are described, and one of them is manaprasada, is satisfaction. One of the austerities of the mind is to just be satisfied. And so this verse reveals that satisfaction is not something that comes from outside by reaching out with my senses and touching something, which people often think. But actually, satisfaction is an austerity that can be cultivated within, is practicing that I'm going to be satisfied with whatever the Lord has given me. And finally, the last point I just wanted to mention. I can't see the clock. Can somebody tell me what time it is? What is it? Quarter to nine. Okay. Okay. So one last point I wanted to mention was in the purport, the longer purport that Srila Prabhupada gives us here. Let's see. We see how the young Sukanya, she wasn't able to distinguish her husband from the other two Ashwini Kumaras because they all went in the lake together and they all received the same heavenly beauty. And if you look in the word for word, it says Surya Varchasaha, with a bodily effulgence like the effulgence of the sun. So they were very beautiful and very effulgent. And when they all three of them came out together, she couldn't tell which one was her husband. And Prabhupada says Sukanya could have selected any one of them as her husband, for one could not distinguish among them. But because she was chaste, she took shelter of the Ashwini Kumaras so that they could inform her who her actual husband was. A chaste woman will never accept any man other than her husband, even if there be some equally as handsome or qualified. And so Prabhupada brings up this point that even though certainly Sukanya could easily have been forgiven if she had embraced the wrong man, and therefore she could have taken the opportunity to enjoy the embrace of a man who was not her husband. She was very chaste, and in her chastity, she preferred to take shelter of the Ashwini Kumars to find out who her actual husband was. And so this is a good example of true faithfulness and true steadiness also. Having this ability that even when we could justify maybe drawing outside the lines or transgressing certain principles, that we'd be easily forgiven by the devotees if we did that. It's a very understandable situation. Still, one remains faithful to one's principles. Then that's true chastity, spiritual chastity, and steadiness. And I just wanted to give a couple examples of this kind of faithfulness and steadiness in spiritual life. Haridas Thakur is a good example. He was threatened by the authorities of the time. Bengal was ruled by Mughal rulers who were of the Muslim faith, and they were not very happy that Haridas Thakur, who was born as a Muslim, had taken up to what was, from their point of view, the Hindu faith, and was chanting Hindu names of God. And therefore they threatened to kill him if he didn't stop chanting Hare Krishna. And he replied that you can cut me into many different pieces, but every piece of my flesh will still continue chanting Hare Krishna. And they followed through with their threats, and they beat him in many marketplaces to make an example of him. But he never gave up his practice of chanting Hare Krishna. He never gave up his faith and devotion to the holy names. And it's such an extreme situation that one could say that, well, if one had given up the chanting of the holy names, I mean, nobody would really blame them, right? The devotees would quickly forgive that person and accept them back into the fold, because it's such a difficult and challenging situation. I mean, how many can withstand just being beaten again and again? And all you have to do to make it stop is just to agree to stop chanting Hare Krishna, at least for that moment, and then you can run away and start chanting Hare Krishna somewhere else. Nobody would have really held it against a devotee for just giving in. But still, he, in spite of the fact that it could have been justified, he insisted on continuing in his devotional practices. And I also thought of the example of Srila Prabhupada, how when he came to New York City, he came to the U.S. Alone at the age of 70, and as somebody who had resided in India his whole life, he had not encountered the kinds of harsh winter that he arrived in New York City, and the winter that year was extremely harsh. It was actually it was like the record year for low temperatures, and after months and months of trying to start this movement and attract young people to the chanting of Hare Krishna, he was just struggling, and it appeared that there may never be any success on the horizon. And so under such circumstances, if he had decided to just return to India and sort of give up the cause, he still would have been considered glorious, I'm sure, by many of his god brothers. He could have easily been forgiven. Yes, it's such a difficult scenario. Of course, we can understand. But even though he could have been justified in giving up, and could have still been probably considered by his peers to be very faithful to his spiritual master, a menial, humble servant, but still he continued on with a deep faithfulness in the words of his spiritual master, and a deep kind of spiritual chastity to the mission of his spiritual master. And so, so certainly we can try to follow in the footsteps of such great souls, and recognize maybe times in our life where okay, we might be justified in giving up in some way, or maybe devotees will easily forgive us if we're in a very difficult situation or extreme situation where we could maybe make a certain kind of compromise. But if we remember the example of Haridas Thakur and Srila Prabhupada, we can maybe try to imbibe their spiritual chastity and just keep going even in the most difficult of circumstances. Okay. Thank you for kindly hearing and tolerating. Does anybody have any comments or reflections, or if you have any questions, I'll try to answer to the best of my ability.
Christian. Thank you, Prabhu, for so many good points. My question is, you spoke about the austerity of having the mind satisfied, being satisfied in mind. It seems that many times we go astray because of the mind, which is not satisfied. So could you elaborate a little bit about this austerity of, keeping the mind satisfied? Could you explain
there's a verses Manu Prasada Samya Tvam Monam Atma Vinigraha Bhava Sangshutir Ityetat Tapamanasam Ujjite. So there's satisfaction of mind, Manu Prasada Samya Tvam. Samya Tvam is, I think, self-control. Maunam, gravity. Maunam, Atma Vinigraha, or Atma Vinigraha might be self-control. Do you remember?
Maunam, I don't know.
Shamya Tvam. I can't remember. Equipoised. What is it?
Purification of existence.
Yeah, Bhava Sangshutir, I think, is purification of one's existence. Yeah, so satisfaction of the mind. So I'll have to speak a bit theoretically here. Let's see. Well, the definition of one of the definitions of austerity that were given by Srila Prabhupada is basically accepting some pleasure or discomfort, some immediate pleasure or discomfort, for the sake of attaining a higher goal, for the sake of spiritual life or pleasing Krishna. So there is an aspect of it that's kind of just a raw effort, you could say, a raw effort to I'm just gonna kind of like clench my fist and just be satisfied. And but at the same time, one of the great treasures of this Krishna conscious philosophy that Prabhupada's given us is that we're taught how to go beyond just mere retention of the senses and mere control of the mind and senses just by this kind of personal clenching our fists and making the effort. There's one verse in the Bhagavad Gita that says Karmendriyani samyamya yaste manasasmanan indriyartha vimudhatma mityachara sa uchite. That is that when they restrain the senses of action, when they restrain one's senses of action, however, the tendency is that within the mind one still remembers all the same sense objects. And so Krishna refers to such a person as a pretender. That person is deluding themselves. They're deluding themselves into thinking that they're self-controlled. They may be preventing the senses from acting, but within their mind they're still meditating on the same thing. So it's kind of like a show bottle performance in the end. And so the great treasure of Krishna consciousness is it teaches us to take the natural attachment that we have. Well, Prabhupada teaches us that actually attachment is a feature of the soul, that the soul by nature as a person is attached to someone or something always. And so we're taught this art of transferring our attachment from material things, wealth, status, learning, beauty, and directing them towards Krishna, towards the beauty of Radha Govinda Madhava, towards the beauty of the descriptions that we find in Srimad Bhagavatam, towards the beauty of the Lord's prasadam, remnants, and from the beauty of dancing with the devotees and singing the holy names of the Lord and engaging in so many endeavors and missions to fulfill the desire of Lord Chaitanya to spread the chanting of the holy names all over the world. There's so many different ways one can engage one's senses: cooking, traveling, and so there's so many ways that actually this is ultimately where the mind gets satisfaction. And Prabhupada states that when one fixes one's mind on Krishna, one finds a final resting point for the mind, which indicates that when I try to satisfy my mind by watching a funny TV show or having a slice of pizza or something, my mind may be able to rest on that and feel a little bit of satisfaction, a sense of contentment for just a moment, but then as soon as the TV show is over or the pizza is finished, then it's immediately searching for something else, and so we never get a rest. But by bringing one's mind on Krishna, one finds a final resting point for the mind. Krishna is Navayovanam Cha. His presence in our life is always fresh and always new. His qualities, his names, they never become stale or old or tired. And so the mind can actually rest on that. forever, without end, and without ever feeling the need to go somewhere else. And so that's why we're in our practice of devotional service, although we don't maybe naturally feel that yet, we're practicing putting our mind on Krishna and then gradually purifying the heart that we can reawaken the dormant love of God that is in the heart of every living entity, and then feel that satisfaction, that final resting point of the mind in Krishna. However, we may also find that in our practice we still have those moments where we have to just go with the fist clenching method of just like, okay, I'm just going to be satisfied. Like I didn't get, there wasn't enough daivad that I could get 3 or 4. I just had to be satisfied with 1 or 2. And so we just clench our fists and just be satisfied. But even then, we're using that kind of method differently from how the jnanis would use it. Those who are trying to just conquer their senses and mind by their own power and merit. We're just using that as kind of a support for what we see as being the real method, which is our dependence and surrender on Krishna, who can come and control that material energy. The mind is one of the elements of the material energy, and Krishna is the controller of the mind. So by engaging the mind and senses in the service of the person who is the Lord of the mind and senses, then they can actually be conquered. Cultivating this okay, I'm just going to be satisfied. That's kind of like one of the tools in the devotee's toolbox as well. So I hope that was a satisfying answer.
Thank you.
Even the Lord Shiva, in the 4th canto, addressing his prayers, he was addressing to Aniruddha and Rishikesh.
Mm-hmm.
And in the presence of the sun, because by worshipping in such a way, he was asking for controlling the mind and the senses.
Mm-hmm.
For satisfaction, Chanakya Pandit says 3 things you should be satisfied with. One's food, one's income, and there is 3rd one. You should be always satisfied with someone. He goes on to say,
Wife.
yes, one's wife. The 3 things you should not be satisfied with: japa, like holy names, knowledge, and what is the 3rd one? Charity.
So you should be satisfied with the food that you have, the income that you have, and with the wife or spouse that you have. Yeah, so it's like a practice. Like you have to, because you can't control what your income is directly. We have a destiny, and so we have to be satisfied. Yeah, so there's that element where it's like you have to practice, even though ultimately the mind is. We depend on Krishna conquering our mind, conquering our hearts. There's still a practice that okay, I'm just going to practice being satisfied with how much money, by Krishna's arrangement, I'm getting. Okay,
and you should not be satisfied with your japa?
You should not be satisfied. That means you can always try to improve it. Same with knowledge, reading,
charity.
Okay, so I imagine it's probably after 9 o'clock, so I'll go ahead and end here. Thank you very much for joining us for Srimad Bhagavatam class. Grantaraja Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Shantatma Prabhu ki.
Jai.